Welcome to School for Relationships. We are here to talk about one of my favorite topics ever today, unconditional self-worth. The reason unconditional self-worth and learning about it feels so liberating is, as we'll be finding out, you already have it. And living in touch with our unconditional self-worth is possible and accessible for everyone. And self-worth is something, it goes deeper than self-confidence or self-love, which we hear a lot of people talking about these days. It's also where self-compassion even comes from, because unlike with self-confidence or self-love, there's nothing like about ourselves that we're focusing on to build confidence, to learn how to love ourselves. Self-worth is something innate. It's about the way we are, the way we've always been, always will be. And this is so powerful because we all already have worth. So you don't need to build this from scratch. You don't need to change anything. What we're trying to do here today is just help you remember what is already true, which is that you are worthy. So I want to get into defining and understanding unconditional self-worth by comparing it to kind of its counterpart, conditional self-worth. Conditional self-worth is the norm for most people. And that's this idea that I am worthy if, worthiness based on conditions. I am worthy if I achieve a certain amount, if I get to a certain level of success, status, social capital, if I have a certain number of friends, maybe if I look a certain way, eat and behave a certain way, all these things that we can kind of pick apart, these are all conditions you could think of to our worth. Whereas the idea with unconditional self-worth is that this is something innate. We are all born with it, and it stays with us throughout our entire lives. We'll always have it. And in that sense, it's similar to the idea of inherent human dignity in a human rights framework. That's this idea that we are born with this kind of aspect of ourselves that is worthy of dignity and respect no matter what. And from the research that I've seen and all the reading that I've been doing on unconditional self-worth, I have come to believe that the one thing that doesn't take our self-worth away, but you could almost think about obscuring it or making it inaccessible, is when we violate the self-worth of another person or being, especially knowingly and intentionally. And when that happens, again, you don't lose being worthy, but you've lost touch with the part of yourself that worth comes from by not respecting the worthiness of another person. So hopefully you're kind of getting a sense of what we're talking about here with self-worth. Let's talk about why does this matter? Why should you care? Especially because my next two videos are going to be going into a lot of strategies for how to reconnect with self-worth. And these strategies, I'm going to be real, they take time and work and dedication. And again, not to build something up from scratch, but even just the process of remembering our self-worth takes a lot of dedication. So why should you bother? Self-worth is how we feel about and perceive and treat ourselves. And because of that, it determines how we feel about and perceive almost every moment of every day. It's also one of the biggest determinants for who we engage in relationships with and how we actually feel about ourselves. That's going to determine who we connect with, how we treat them, how we let them treat us. And with relationships being one of those things that gives life the most meaning, but can also bring the most pain, this is where we start to see how important self-worth is in determining our entire quality of life. And what's good news is that self-worth isn't fixed in stone. Cultivating it and reconnecting to it is an area of our life where we have some of the most choice and agency in how we feel on a daily basis. And choosing to start viewing and treating ourselves in respect of our own worth is one of the things that can greatly reduce suffering across so many areas of our lives. And just to get into more of like the why, a lot of self-worth, most of it I would say is actually unconscious. So we all have certain like conscious thoughts and beliefs for what we think about ourselves. Self-worth is something deeper. It exists mostly in the unconscious, which you could think of as basically just our brains and our nervous systems, and how they have been wired to perceive us, to behave, and to treat ourselves. And so the way I like to think about this is the time that self-worth shows up the most clearly is one of those like crying on the bathroom floor moments. Let's say it's one of those days where nothing's gone right, you've come home and you've just collapsed, you've hit your rock bottom for that day. When you are there, are you thinking the whole time in your head, I am the worst person ever, I'm so terrible, how could I have done that? Or are you thinking, this is so hard, this is so painful, and I will find a way through this. I can do this. I will get over this. Those are two very different ways of viewing and treating ourselves. And that's kind of where we see like these like tests, especially when we're up against a wall, so to speak, of where our self-worth is actually at. And given that self-worth is unconscious most of the time, again, it's just how our brains and nervous systems have been wired to perceive us, we also see one of the biggest impacts of where our self-worth is at through confirmation bias. And basically, we are unconsciously reinforcing positive and or negative beliefs about ourselves all the time. And so this is where identifying some of those core beliefs, what are the core beliefs that I have about like who I am as a person? When we identify those beliefs, we start to see how we are actually reinforcing and recreating those beliefs in our real lives through how we interpret the events that happen to us, what we focus on, as well as how we behave, who we're spending time with. So building self-worth, positive too, is one of those things that will also snowball because we've got confirmation bias on our side with the positive beliefs too. And not only does our unconditional self-worth determine obviously how we feel about and treat ourselves, it also determines so much of how other people unconsciously perceive and treat us. People tend to treat us similarly to the way that we hold and treat ourselves. And not only that, but connecting to unconditional self-worth, it doesn't just change the way people see us, it changes the way we see all other people. Because by connecting to unconditional self-worth on a deep and visceral and embodied level, we know what it feels like and we can start to see it and feel it in other people in such a deep way. And you could think about it in this way. By connecting to unconditional self-worth in ourselves, we've had to sift through all the guilt and shame and fear and really kind of dig into the part of ourselves that no matter what is worthy of dignity and respect. And if we can't see ourselves as worthy of dignity and respect, our compassion for others is also going to hit a limit. And any ways that we are judging ourselves will eventually be reflected out in terms of how we judge other people. And so as you work to, release judgment of yourself and connect, even if I don't like a certain part about myself, can I connect to my own worthiness still? This allows us to basically to drop the judgment of anyone else being worthy based on any one quality. And it's shedding light on a lot of biases that we may have against other people, biases we usually grew up with and were taught, that cause us to subjectively assign value to certain people based on certain traits, things they have, ways of being. And if we're no longer subjectively assigning value to people, we can see the value in all people. Again, we don't have to like them and want to spend time with them, but we'll be approaching them truly respecting their inherent dignity. So what happens when we start to get back in touch with an unconditional sense of our own self-worth? Again, I want to reinforce, like, if this is sounding like abstract or far away or hard to reach, because self-worth is innate, no matter how you were raised, what you've been through, how you've been socialized, we can change the way that we see ourselves. And we'll be talking a lot more about how to do that in the next few videos. And what I've seen working with, a lot of clients on this is when we're first starting to shift from conditional into unconditional self-worth, there can be a lot of fears and concerns that come up during this process, specifically around like motivation levels and staying productive. I've had a lot of clients by now ask me, if I'm just like trusting and believing that I am worthy and I'm not like bullying myself in my head all the time, will I still be like carrying out the daily tasks of life? Like, will I still want to go to work and work as hard? Am I gonna stop wanting to like exercise or eat healthy? Like, will I still be like texting friends back or replying to emails? Like, what happens actually when we develop unconditional self-worth? And I think these concerns come from the ways that we're like conditioned to view accepting ourselves as then all of a sudden becoming like passive and caring and doing less. And I want to take a closer look at this because this is such a common fear. When we only feel worthy if we do a certain thing, our actions are then motivated by the need to like try to feel good enough. And so we're self-motivating oftentimes primarily through guilt, shame, and fear. We're basically like punishing ourselves into being motivated. And that type of willpower usually breaks down long term. And we've seen, hopefully by now y'all have heard, like so many studies on how much more effective positive reinforcement is than punishment. And I want to say I still understand, if this has been a mode of operating, like motivating yourself through internal pressure, through guilt, through shame, through fear, if that's your mode of operation for your whole life, it can be scary to let go of that. And there is a little bit of like self-trust, that initial leap of faith of like, I want to try to motivate myself a different way. I want to motivate myself through trying to take care of myself and take care of what feels good for me, and to see how that works. So if you're still having doubts, I totally understand. I just want us to remember and come back to conditional self-worth at the end of the day basically is a feeling that we are not enough or not capable. So when we're looking at the core beliefs attached to conditional self-worth, we're looking at beliefs that sound some version of like, I cannot, or I am not, ... Whereas unconditional self-worth connects us to the feelings that we are enough and we are capable. So we're looking at positive core beliefs that sound something like I am and I can. And when we feel capable, or we at least trust I can learn, I can build my capacity, we're much more willing to take meaningful risks, to try challenging things, and to push ourselves more in the ways that matter. And so yes, I want to acknowledge it's true. Some of the concerns or doubts are founded in that we may lose motivation for some relationships in some parts of our lives. I don't think this has to be the like routine, responsibility focused things. I often find that what I've seen is people might lose that motivation for the parts of their lives and the relationships that already weren't as authentic for you or as fulfilling. And so, yes, there can be an initial period when we're really reconnecting to unconditional self-worth that involves some letting go and even some loss. But this is such a gift long term because we are freeing up our time, our energy, and our mental and emotional space to focus on what truly gives back to us, to what feeds us, to what makes life meaningful for us. And this is where we get to ask the most exciting and terrifying and liberating question of our lives, which is, what does living a life that honors my self-worth look and feel like for me? What does living a life that honors my self-worth look and feel like for me? And this is where we've moved all the way up those pyramids of like universal human needs, and we're getting to look at self-actualization, what this means for us, taking all this potential of all that we can be and actually asking ourselves, what does my potential look like actualized, realized? So hopefully y'all are already excited. I have even more good news, which is that accessing a sense of unconditional self-worth is easier than it probably initially sounds. And the reason why is because there is a state of being, kind of like a state of mind within each of us that we can all access. Guess what? You have already accessed this at some point in your life. And this state of being sees and knows like our full worth and dignity more. We see and we know that we are worthy when we're in this state of being, this state of mind, which means that unconditional self-worth doesn't have to be this far away, unachievable thing. You actually don't need to change again. You're already worthy. And we're really just trying to remember what is already true about you. And we do this by learning how to reconnect to the state of mind where we already see ourselves more clearly, free of distortions. And we've got all these different types of evidence-based therapy. You know, as a therapist, I gotta bring this in. We've got all these different types of therapy and all this research that backs this idea that there is an aspect of ourselves that remains protected and whole no matter what we go through. And this whole and protected part of ourselves allows us to see ourselves in a more whole and protective and loving way. And different types of therapy have different names for this state of being or state of mind, but the key idea that they share is that regardless of adversity, there is this inner state of being that allows us to see ourselves more clearly and compassionately, free of those distortions. And anything can distort the way we see ourselves or kind of cloud the way we see ourselves. Our mood, our anxiety, so much of how we're feeling on a daily basis. How do we see through that and remember and reconnect to our self-worth? So let's go over some of these different ways of thinking about this state of being or state of mind. I want to start with like a neurological perspective. So we'll be focusing on the brain and the nervous system. And from this perspective, we can access this state of being where we're more clearly able to see our self-worth when our frontal lobe is activated and we are in our ventral vagal nervous system, aka the parasympathetic nervous system, or maybe rest and digest. Building on that, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, it's one of the top evidence-based therapy modalities for trauma out there. The founder of EMDR, Francis Shapiro, calls this kind of state of being the adaptive neural network. Another term, super nerdy, is adaptive information processing. And you could think about that as the neural network, the webs of neurological pathways in our brain that connect us to experiences of safety, connectedness, and our own capacity. So you could think about that as like literally in our brains, the like web of positive experiences that connect us to positive core beliefs about ourselves. And depending on where you're at in this process, some people might have really strong webs of positive beliefs that wire and fire together. Others may need a lot of reinforcement of those neurological pathways, but they're still there and they're still accessible. So let's take this and move a little bit like less sciencey, still evidence-based, evidence-backed, but I want to talk about internal family systems. This is a type of therapy that I think has one of the most beautiful ways of describing this state of being, which IFS, or internal family systems, just calls the self. So anything that isn't this, IFS thinks of as parts, whereas our self is this innate aspect of ourselves that's always there, that is known by the 8 C's. So it's compassionate, creative, curious, confident, courageous, calm, connected, and clear. Such a beautiful way of looking at it. Then we can take dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. DBT has this idea of wise mind, which I also love, and wise mind balances out on one side emotion mind, so we're not suppressing our emotions, we're feeling them, we're in tune with them, but we're also balancing in and still accessing logical mind. We're still thinking through things rationally with a long-term perspective. And when you bring emotion mind and rational mind together, the meeting place in the middle of these two things is wise mind. Just to give one more example, we also have acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, that uses a few different names, but the two big ones are self as context, or thinking about the observing self. And this is just the idea that we are not the content of our thoughts, feelings, behavior, but we are the observer that is viewing the larger context of the way we're thinking, feeling, and behaving. And finally, as you're hearing me talk, if you're coming from a religious or spiritual background, you might be connecting to some of your own ways of thinking about, connection to consciousness, connection to God. So we've got a whole span of different ways of thinking about this state of being. But no matter what name we give this state, what I want everyone to take away here and remember is, number one, you are born and will always remain worthy. And number two, there is a state of being that allows us to see ourselves and access our worth more clearly, to see ourselves more clearly. And what we'll be talking about in the videos coming up is how we can reconnect with this state of being, and practically, concretely, what does it look like to live a life that honors our inherent self-worth? So, again, just to close and re-emphasize this, I'm a trauma-focused therapist, and with my background and training, low self-worth, anything where we're viewing ourselves as not worthy, I think of as a distorted sense of self. It's a distortion. And the way we can understand this is typically it's easier for us to see the inherent worth and dignity in others. Like, hey, no matter what, I don't have to like them, I don't have to want to be around them. They're still worthy of some level of respect. We don't always treat ourselves that same way. And so our starting point here is just treating ourselves with the same level of basic respect and courtesy that we treat most others. And this is especially about how we treat ourselves in our own heads. How are we talking to ourselves and feeling about ourselves? And when we talk about how to reconnect to unconditional self-worth, I'm going to split this up in like 2 primary strategies. We'll first talk about a more gradual and long-term process to reconnecting with self-worth. And this is both a behavioral and a social approach, We're looking at how we're behaving. Are we behaving in ways that honor and protect our self-worth? And we're also looking socially at who are we spending time with and around? What is our social context? So that's our gradual strategies. And then we'll also talk about some shorter term, more emotionally intense strategies where we are going into our brains, bodies, and nervous systems to change our unconscious core beliefs about ourselves. Those strategies I'm mostly going to recommend working through with the help of a licensed therapist. However, with both the short-term and the gradual approach, I'll be talking about a lot of ways we can start to reconnect to self-worth, even if you don't currently have access to a therapist that you're working with. So we've got so many exciting things to cover. Before we get into that, let me know if you're feeling clear on what unconditional self-worth is, why you should care. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and please subscribe to this channel so I can keep producing this type of content and we can keep the conversation going.